Hey everyone, Ponyo here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of After Dinner Mints. I highly encourage everyone watching to join us in the Art Blocks Discord. A link to our Discord can be found in the description of this video. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode of our weekly show. And now to introduce our guest for this afternoon, we have generative artist, itsgalo.
Hey,
How's it going?
it's good.
Well, thanks so much for joining me on After Dinner Mints. You just released your curated drop just a couple weeks ago, so definitely want to dive into that in just a little bit. But maybe you can kick things off by telling us a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a multidisciplinary designer. My background is mostly in architecture. So I studied architecture in college, and then I did my master's in architecture at MIT, where I was exposed to a lot of different approaches to design in general. And so even though I'm an architectural designer, I dip my toes in a lot of other fields. Most recently in kind of software and experimental software and creative coding. So I learned how to code when I was a teenager. My dad had a really early version of Flash in our computer. And I remember learning how to make movies, the little movie clips and animations in Flash. And so that was actually my introduction to creative coding, let's say. But then I didn't end up pursuing that. So that in a way that kind of just sat on the shelf, that knowledge sat on the shelf for a while until I took a processing class in grad school, where we looked at the potential for generative code to, let's say, inform architectural design in some way. And that really piqued my interest. And so then I started messing around with that. And that brought me to where I am now, which is, I would say, to the intersection of art, architecture, and generative design.
Great. And were there any, when you started getting into, generative art, were there any artists that you kind of looked up to? You mentioned processing. So, obviously there's a bunch of people that are involved in that. But yeah, I'm curious to know, what are those people that you looked up to early on?
Yeah, I mean, Casey Reese, obviously a kind of legend, known for processing, and Ben Fry. Some of the early coders are super inspirational just because they were making their own tools, and I thought that was incredibly liberating. And so I wasn't necessarily a fan of the artworks themselves per se. I mean, those were amazing, but I think what was more interesting to me were the initiative to actually build your own tool that could help you produce new things, right? And so I really looked up to all of the kind of early adopters of processing. There were some architects that were using it early on as well. Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample, they were architects that were collaborating with processing designers early in the, let's say, 2004s, 2005s. Let's see, Golan Levin, also sort of legend in the creative coding space. Marius Watts as well. And so those were the kind of figures that were leading, I think I would say, pioneering the open source creative coding software world. And even though I was sort of looking from the outside, I was pretty inspired by their work.
Great. And, obviously we're in this crazy space of, NFTs and crypto. Like, what was your introduction into the space? And, when you first learned about it, did it make sense, or did it take a little bit of time in order for you to kind of get the ball rolling?
Yeah, I mean, I learned about NFTs mostly from the artists that I was following. I wasn't really that into crypto when I was at MIT, even though there was a lot of buzz around that, because I think they had something to do with it apparently. But what really interested me were the posts and the images that all the artists that I follow were sharing on Twitter and Instagram and just social media in general. People like Andrew Benson, who I've been following for a number of years. He was involved with Foundation at the early stages, and he was saying, "Oh, I'm doing these things, making these artworks through on this platform," and I thought that was really interesting. And then I've also been following Beeple for a while, just on Instagram, and then he started to talk a lot about NFTs, and I became really curious, and I was like, well, maybe I should get into this, because I've been fiddling around with digital art for a couple of years, and we'll see where that what I can do with it, essentially. And I was really interested in this sort of concept of it. I think this idea of digital ownership was really, really interesting, mostly because I don't think I'd ever owned like a real piece of art. I mean, I think I've got some signed prints from other artists, but I've never been able to really like afford like an original artwork or anything like that. And all of a sudden, these artists that I really admire were selling art that was actually kind of affordable, and it would be authenticated, right? And to me, that was super innovative. That we can do that now, right? I didn't have to just save the image that I liked on my hard drive. I could actually have an authenticated sort of edition of that artwork, right? And so I just started, I dove in, and I joined Discord channels, and I was grinding trying to get a invite to Foundation, and I got an invite to Foundation, and I kept thinking, well, I have all of this work that I've done in the past. Is it worth minting? Would anybody appreciate it? Would anybody like it? And so I did it. And in the beginning, I just minted a couple of like, weird things that I'd made in the past. They weren't very cohesive. I wasn't thinking about like a series or anything like that. I was just trying to figure out the whole space and how this whole thing worked. So I didn't really mint anything that I would consider extremely valuable, because I was worried that, this might just be gone one day or something. But slowly I started to get more and more confident with it. And now it's, it sort of got out of control, and here I am.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe you can share, some of those early generative art pieces that you're talking about, whether the ones on Foundation or earlier than that.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, okay. I saw it. Is that the Foundation page?
Yeah, so this is the Foundation page. So as you can see, there's nothing really that much on it. And like I said, I started minting some older, more architectural works. This was a design for a speculative house that was made out of elevators that I worked with my partner, and we made this little animation that just loops. And I thought that this would be a really good candidate for a digital artwork that was only digital. And so I minted this as I think this was my first mint on Foundation, was just this little still life house model. Oops.
That's a really cool piece. I like that a lot.
And then this one actually was a generative art piece that I made, and then I framed in this digital frame that was modeled in Blender, because I thought it would be really interesting to play with a 2D image and then this kind of virtual space. This was, again, super early when we were talking about, well, what does the space of digital galleries look like? Does it have to look like a museum? And so I thought it would be kind of tongue-in-cheek to put like an outlet in this virtual space, and put like a little sign as well to suggest that this is an artwork or something. And then I started getting a little bit more confident, and I started making works that would be specific for that would be specifically minted, as opposed to just minting older works. On Hic et Nunc, actually, this was really a really great playground early on. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but this was this sort of underground club for Tezos NFTs back in like February or March. I think it's when it officially started, March 2021. And I think this was the earliest piece that I minted, which was this processing. It was this generative painting that was made of generative gradients, scribbles.
Is it cool to kind of look back on, you know, some of these older pieces and how you've kind of grown in the space?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I look back and I know that I've always been interested in these ideas of paintings that paint themselves. So you can see that as a kind of continual thread. But I think it's also really interesting to me at least, to reflect on the way that my approach has kind of evolved.
Mm-hmm.
So these, for example, were processing scripts that I had made where I was using, I built an imported physics engine, and I was letting the physics kind of control these blobs on the canvas, but then I would interact with them and I would paint with them as well. So this one, I think this script right here, this is an example of this thing running live.
That's awesome. That's a great piece. And that's on Hic-et-Nunc, you said?
Yeah, those were some of my earliest Hic-et-Nunc works. I treated them kind of like a sketchbook. So, you know, I sold them for 1 or 2 Tezos or 5 Tezos or something. I can't remember, which is, you know, $5 or something. And I just thought that people might be interested in the sketches that I was thinking about or that I was making as part of my process.
I love it. Yeah. Let's let's talk a little bit about, you know, your project on Art Blocks now, called RASTER, which came out just a few weeks ago. You know, I have so many questions about this project. It's sold out. It's a curated drop. It's a beautiful thing. But yeah, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that initial idea behind the project and kind of the meaning of the project name.
Yeah. So RASTER really came out of this idea of a painting that paints itself forever, because I was making these processing sketches, and something that I really liked about all of these little pieces of software was that it could really paint itself forever. Like you could just keep going, right? You can leave the processing script running forever and it would generate something, right? And I thought that that would be a really cool thing to explore in terms of like a long form project. And so that was the catalyst, I would say, for RASTER itself. And then if you notice in all of these projects as well, there is an exploration of the material of the screen. I would say like the materiality of digital color and real-time graphics, which is something that I think we take for granted. Like I think we just say things like JPEGs are just like pictures, right? They're just digital pictures, but really they have their own material, right? They're not like ink has its own material, and emulsion chemicals in photography, they have their own material, right? And so pixels, they have their own material too. And I think it would be a disservice to take that for granted in a way, right? And so I was wondering what a project would look like that took full advantage of the materiality of the pixel itself. And the pixel is basically always represented in a grid, right? In a raster grid. And so the name of the project is obviously a reference to the structure of digital images, which is the raster grid. And it really embodied both my kind of academic research, which in which I'm looking at the materiality of computer graphics and software. And I'm currently teaching at the University of Kentucky, so I've got like responsibilities to conduct pretty serious academic research. So there was a kind of seriousness to it, but then there was also a expressive dimension to the project itself. I wanted it to be beautiful, and I wanted it to be aesthetically pleasing, and so it was tricky, because I think some of my earlier works were they're not necessarily like very beautiful. I think they're interesting, but I wanted this to be almost like a masterpiece type of thing, right? But made up of pixels that you can read.
Definitely. And you mentioned the University of Kentucky. I'm curious, have you talked to your students about this project, or kind of the work that you're building on the blockchain?
I haven't actually talked to my students about crypto art or anything like that. I've talked to them about generative art. I teach algorithms and generative procedures for designing in some of my courses, but I haven't actually talked to them about my own personal work, or at least the work that I've done in the NFT space. Mostly because I think it's a little too soon, and maybe it's a little bit too close to home, right?
Yeah.
So I've got lectures that I give on things like digital color theory, things like geometry and rule-based design, and I've got a syllabus that I wrote that introduces students to P5.js as a kind of design tool and as a tool for making other tools. So I teach around the subject, but I haven't figured out just yet how to introduce NFTs, for example, or how to start a conversation about that, because it seems like it's a little bit abstract and maybe a little bit out of their wheelhouse, because it has to do with like markets and blockchain, and I still don't really know too much about blockchain, to be honest. But yeah,
that's totally fair. And just to kind of touch back a little bit about the creation of this project, is this based off of an older project that you worked on before you got into the space, or is this something that once you had some pieces on Hikitnunk, that's when you kind of started diving into creating the project RASTER?
So RASTER, I would say officially started in January of this year. That's really when I started the script, and I was just working on it. But it's based off of a couple of other techniques that I've been honing over the past year in 2021. Techniques where I built my own algorithm for creating looping gestures. I made my own shaders to produce dithering effects. So to downscale images, essentially, so you can see those chunky pixels. So in a way, I've been sort of polishing my skills for the past year in order to get ready for to build RASTER, because I knew that I wanted to make a big project, but I didn't really have too much familiarity with shaders up until last year. I was mostly coding in JavaScript and processing, but I hit a wall with JavaScript and processing, because I really wanted all of these pixels to move at the same time. And to really do that efficiently, you have to use shaders. You have to be able to access the GPU. And so RASTER ended up being actually a really graphics intensive program. I'm sure you can hear it, your computer kind of heating up.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, you mentioned, kind of the importance of using shaders, and, you explain on your website a technique called pixel overpainting, which I'd love for you to kind of explain to us. But yeah, I'll just kind of love the overall idea of like the process for creating the art of each mint.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, pixel overpainting was kind of an accident. So I was messing around with layering shaders at low transparencies together, and then using a brush, basically like a digital brush, to paint on these different layers and seeing how that filters through the other shaders. And what ended up happening was that the paint itself built up to a certain point. So the colors built up to a certain point, and then they achieved equilibrium. So it wouldn't. So a color would kind of mix with another color, and then it would settle into a final color, which was really interesting, because I was also combining this with feedback effects. So I was taking an image of the canvas and then feeding that back in, so that when you paint, the paint, the pixels that you just painted kind of smear. It's a pretty standard way of producing like fluid type of effects in shaders. And so what I realized is that if you just layer a few of these at different levels of transparency, you can control that feedback in such a way that the colors mix and then they keep bleeding, but they don't get any more desaturated, or they don't ever fade out, and they don't get any brighter either. They just kind of stay at that color. And even if you paint over it, it'll still go back to that same color. And so I started messing around with this technique and playing with different brush types. So you like a solid brush, a more feathered brush that's more of a gradient type of brush, and that's what I ended up using for raster. Because if you repeat the same stroke on top of itself over and over again, you'll get that buildup, and then it eventually just gets to equilibrium, and then it just and then the same sort of color bleeding just happens over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's kind of tricky to explain without going into the code, but it produces a really interesting effect because it's kind of like a rhythmic painting.
Great, that's awesome. And you're talking about just colors in general, but I'm curious to know how you went about selecting those color palettes, and like, do you have a process? Do you pick those color palettes based off of what you see out in the real world, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, I use a variety of different techniques. I personally don't think I'm the greatest at color. I'm partially colorblind. I'm like partially red-green colorblind, which is kind of interesting. And I remember in college, I got a B in my color theory class because I just couldn't mix the colors correctly. So I wouldn't say I'm the greatest at color. But for raster, it was kind of a tricky process to select the color palettes, because usually I start with an image and I start filtering colors from an image that I like, for example, or from like an existing painting that I'm inspired by, and that's typically how I start to set up color palettes. I also use some Rizzo printing color palettes, which I think are just really nice. And there's some online generators like Adobe Color as well. And they those are really cool color palette generators in a way. So I have to start somewhere. So it's usually one of those things. But for raster, it was tricky because if you notice, raster is actually only made ever out of 27 colors at most, because of the dithering filter. And so even though there are all of these illusions of different colors, at any given time, you can only get 27 of them. So it's like it's a quantized process. And what I was really interested in is getting these 27 colors to mix in a way with using the dithering shader to give the illusion of a spectrum of different colors. And so if you'll notice, the palettes are actually pretty bright. There's not very much subtlety in the colors, and that's because I wanted there to be enough contrast when the colors are mixed together, right? And it was really tough. I think the palettes weren't actually finalized until after the process of curation. So after the raster went through the curation board, I got some feedback about the colors, and the board said that sometimes they look nice, sometimes they look really muddy, and that muddiness was a result of these colors mixing a little bit too much, right? Mm-hmm. And so I had to go back and really think about, well, how can I pick colors that are, and different enough from one another, but still are harmonious in a kind of color palette right? So that they tell a kind of story in a way. And so for me, being an architect, I thought about spaces and about the kind of color stories that spaces tell. And I thought that it would be really nice to categorize the color palettes in terms of like spaces, right? What kind of colors do you see when you're in a certain space? And so I just named them after common spaces that we might be familiar with, like lounge, garden, airport. I spent a lot of times in airports, and I thought that was a kind of an interesting one because I think there's sometimes patterns in airport carpets that look generative.
Yeah.
And so airport was kind of like a little inside joke. But yeah, I just wanted to get the feeling of an environment in terms of the colors.
Great. Yeah, I love always hearing stories about how artists select the names for a color palette because, yeah, I think that's a moment for you to kind of just have some fun and obviously, select the names that have, meaning to yourself. So I appreciate you sharing that. So each mint is actually rendered live. So for anyone that's, checking out this project for the first time, make sure you check it out in live view. But was that something that you kind of envisioned from the beginning? I know that most of your pieces, from what I've seen, they all have, dynamic, they're moving, there's some animation to it. Was that always the vision from the beginning for this project, Raster? Or is that, it was, potentially static images first and then kind of eventually got into that animated element?
It was always supposed to be animated, and the reason is because I wanted it to paint itself forever, and I wanted to see what happens if you just leave it running. Like I think if you leave it running, there are some artworks that if you leave running, they sort of they mutate or maybe they crash. I don't know, or maybe they just stay the same. And so I wanted to make an artwork that you could run theoretically live forever, and it would loop in some way. And so around the time that I was developing raster, I was also messing around with four-dimensional noise, which is a technique where you can create randomness in the tradition of Perlin noise, but you can have it loop back in on itself. So you're manipulating a parameter in the fourth dimension that basically brings the cross section of the noise back to the origin. And so when I started messing around with that technique, I realized that this would be a really good project to try it out. And I tried it out in a lot of other projects as well to produce perfectly looping noisy GIFs. I think it produces a really interesting effect because you can't really pinpoint the repeating point, right? I think that's what's really interesting about the GIF format. And so I wanted to make this a looping live piece from the very beginning. And it was tricky because I know that a lot of art blocks, collectors, they like to print out their their pieces, right? And so there always has to be a frame that's the static one, right? That serves as the preview image that you can plot out and sell as a signed print or something like that. And so for me, the driving force for raster was, can I make it interesting when it's animated, and can I make it interesting when it's static? Which was a really, really tough mission. But I think for the most part, I achieved it, because if you notice that the animation does repeat itself. I mean, there might be like smaller changes or subtle differences because shader feedback is a little bit unpredictable. Because when you create the same image and you take an image of that image and feed it back into itself, there's little room for error. But for the most part, it is a seamless loop. And if you pause it, you can sort of see the outline of the brushes sometimes, But for the most part, it kind of bleeds into a kind of gradient field at any time that you pause it.
I do like that, simple functionality of having the ability to pause, midway while it's kind of creating and live rendering. Because there were a couple moments where I was checking out some of the mints. I was like, ooh, I want to like just sit with this moment for just a few seconds and kind of study what's being created. And so I think that was just like a nice little touch. Is that something that was kind of added late in the process or early on?
You mean the fading in animation, or
the fading in, but then also like the pause functionality. I know that's super simple, but like just I think just having that element is just like a nice way for people to kind of like pause, take something in. But yeah, just curious to know if that was more of a late edition or something early on.
Yeah, that actually was a late edition, mostly because I realized that maybe some computers can't handle raster as well as others. And so I wanted to add the option of stopping it just in case, things start to freeze or something like that, right? And the other options to change the pixel sizes, those came in the early stages. I always wanted a kind of next level of exploration for the piece, but the pause function and the capture function, I think those came a little bit later, just as features that I thought would be useful for the project.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of features, are you able to talk a little on, some of the features in this project? A couple of them that I wrote down that I think, maybe some of the collectors or would-be collectors might be interested in are, the warped subdivisions, feedback resolution, and then also that chaos X and chaos Y axis.
Yeah, maybe we can actually look at the project.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely change this to the shared screen.
Yeah, so let's, if we look at Mint Zero, for example, we'll see some of its features, right? So warp subdivisions and feedback resolution and the chaos. These are the main structure of the project itself. So warp subdivisions is actually refers to the subtle grid that you see in some of the pieces. So like for Mint Zero is actually a really good example because you can actually almost count the warp subdivisions. You can sort of follow these warped grid lines. And you'd see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I think that's how it works. It's tricky because it's the warp subdivisions refer to the way that noise is being tiled. And so noise is always going to want to do its own wiggly thing. And the subdivisions just tells the system how much to subdivide or to tile that noise. The feedback resolution, I think, is probably my favorite feature because the feedback resolution is the resolution for the bleeding of the color. So it's key to the overpainting effect. And so here you see that the feedback resolution here is 640, which means that it's 640 pixels wide in the X direction. And so anything that has this 640 pixels, so any of the pieces that are 640 pixels feedback resolution, you see are a lot smoother. You see the gradients are a lot smoother. The transitions between some of the zones are smoother. But if you see some, let's see. If you see some of the ones that have the lower resolution, the feedback resolution, then you start to see what that feedback resolution is actually doing, right? So the 64 pixel feedback resolution gives you a much chunkier bleeding effect, right? And so it looks almost, it looks a little bit more pixelated. I think it looks more like a tapestry or like a weaving type of material. Personally, I'm the 64 feedback resolution is probably my favorite. I think it looks kind of like an ancient temple or something sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
And then you can see, if the 256, all of these are just taken from, powers of 2 type of resolutions, standard resolutions. So 256, it's a little bit smooth, but you can still see some pixel chunks. So that's the feedback resolution is really what gives the structure of the figures that you see. And then chaos. So chaos X is, chaos in the X direction and chaos in the Y direction. These refer to levels of distortion for the noise, for the feedback noise that you are seeing when the color moves. The chaos in the Y and in the X sometimes they produce like little curls. And they also produce the compression of the piece itself. So when you see a lot of verticals together, I think this is this is high chaos on the x-axis and low feedback resolution. If you mix some of these, like high chaos and high resolution, I think there's only one. Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah.
So there's only one. 139 has both of these, and you see what it does. There's a lot of curls, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it starts to look almost like a hurricane or something. And there's a lot of compression in it, right? So you see a lot of tight, jagged edges in between the colors.
That's very cool. That's awesome.
And then, with lower chaos, you get much, much smoother pieces, right? So I think mid zero is a little bit lower. So you see these are a little bit, they're smoother. The transitions are more geometric, right? These ones are also super nice because these remind me of almost like land art type of sculptures where you look at them from above and you see like paths and divots and walls or something.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate talking just a little bit about those features that some of the collectors might be interested in knowing. So I appreciate that. And we kind of talked a little bit about displays a little bit. I know this is definitely intensive for people displaying digitally, but I'm curious to know, like, what is, if you could have collectors, if you could be like, hey, this is my preferred way to display the art, what would that be?
Yeah, my preferred way to display the art, I mean, in an ideal setting, let's say a gallery or a museum or something like that, I would have a dedicated machine with a gaming card, and running on a 4:3 monitor, right? So the ratio of raster is 4:3, so vertically oriented standard screen, essentially. I mean, I guess now they're 16:9, but when I was growing up, everything was 4:3.
Yeah.
And so, a big 4:3 screen with a machine that has some dedicated graphics card would be great. I have a Jetson Nano, which is it's a little NVIDIA computer that I've used in exhibitions in the past. I haven't actually ran raster on it. It's buried in my closet somewhere. But I suspect that would be able to run it pretty well because it's like a Raspberry Pi, but with like a built-in really heavy-duty GPU that's made for machine learning. And so NVIDIA sells these for like $100 or something like that.
Okay.
Which is pretty nice for a tiny little thing that's like this big. I think the Raspberry Pi 4s have also got better graphics hardware now, but I don't know if they can run shaders very well.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it just sounds like the technology, I feel like $100 is very affordable for something, that's intensive as raster, but Yeah, I think, obviously digital displays have a long way to go, but it sounds like they're kind of going in that right direction. So I look forward to the day where, anyone can kind of buy a digital frame and easily put their art directly on that display. But I noticed on the website you also have, which is raster.club, you have a gift tool on the website. Can you talk a little bit about that and how collectors can kind of interact with it?
Yeah, I can actually show you show how it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you go to raster.club and go down to GIFs. So this this tiny little tool here just allows you to get a seamless GIF of any invocation of raster, right? So this actually taps into the ArtBlocks API. So all of the iterations of raster are in here, and you can just pick a random one. And then it gives you the hash. And when you click on this hash, you get a version of raster that's kind of like minimized. So this is like raster light in a way, and it runs a little bit faster because it runs at half the frames than the one on ArtBlocks, but the hash is exactly the same. And this is actually at, I think, 540 by what is it, 720 maybe, the resolution. And then it builds up exactly like the real live version. And you'll see that it gets to that equilibrium point at some point. I would say in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, it gets to perfect equilibrium. But you can start to grab a GIF anywhere just by pressing G. And then you see it says recording loop. And then it outputs a looping mini version of raster for you. And so I've optimized this so that I think the GIFs are, they should be under 15 megabytes, which I think is the Twitter compression limit. But I think it's a really nice way to make a version of raster or make an iteration of raster that is shareable and lightweight, right? Because I think, sometimes with these live artworks, anything that's GPU heavy is really difficult to deal with. And so I have an option to do this. And then for any collectors that are interested, I've also been making a high resolution video so that they can show them on frames that maybe don't support live JavaScript.
Great, that's awesome. And I noticed also that there is collectors are eligible to receive a signed print. Is that correct? And what's the process for that?
Yeah, so I've started printing here. I have a fine art printer, and I've got a big stack of cotton rag archival papers. And for any collectors that currently hold a token of raster, all I'm asking for is a processing fee for shipping and just packaging it, etc. And they can send me that via their Ethereum address so that I can verify that and double cross check with the tokens on OpenSea, and then I'll just ship and sign a copy, a version. So what I've been doing is I've been plotting the ArtBlocks preview image for most collectors, but collectors also have the ability to pick any frame because the project is animated, right? And so it produces 180 frames in total before it starts to loop again. And so if any collectors want a specific frame of the animation, a specific point in time, they should just let me know, and then I can plot that instead of the preview image. But I know that I think a lot of collectors like the preview image because it's the one associated with ArtBlocks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think everyone's just going to be a little bit different, but I think that's just like a nice little bonus for collectors.
Yeah, and then I think it allows for subsequent collectors that purchase the token to have a unique edition as well. because I'm allowing anybody. So even if it's sold on secondary, then the secondary owner will also be eligible for a print.
I love that. That's great. Well, yeah, maybe if you have if you're able to, I would love to kind of just see what some of those favorite mints are from this project. Either your favorites or maybe some pieces that kind of surprised you.
From Raster, yeah, let's take a look. Is there an easy way to browse this? Oh, probably on OpenSea.
Yeah, OpenSea kind of works, and Archipelago. I think everyone has their specific way how they want to do it.
Yeah. So some of my favorite ones are the ones that, again, I say are a little bit unpredictable. So 26 was definitely one of my favorites. 26 has this figural quality that I didn't expect, because most of them are kind of like field, and they're like fields, like color fields, basically. But Raster 26 has this really interesting sort of figure that comes out. It's almost like a machine part or something. It's very sculptural.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's a nice one.
Yeah, and when it renders in its entirety, it has this like big red stripe, which I think is great. Some of my other favorite ones, I really like these. I mean, 53 is a good example of a kind of hurricane version where you see a lot of swirls, and it kind of transitions from a smooth surface to like a lot of swirls at the on one end. I feel like we have to come up with some kind of a set of nicknames for some of these, because it was hard to predict what these things were going to look like in the end, so I couldn't name them. But something like this is something kind of like a hurricane version or something.
Yeah, especially with those colors, with it almost reminds me of like the colors that they have on a radar when there is a hurricane or like a huge storm, with those blues and greens and yellows, kind of like the Doppler radar. That's awesome.
Yeah. I think one of my other favorites, I think, was 148 or something. Oh, this one was great, 91, where it has like this little mask type of figure. This one, so Raster 99, I think glitched when it was capturing a preview. And so the preview itself was really interesting because it became this little seahorse. But if you actually let the Raster 99 run, you'll see that it's not just that little seahorse. It's actually like a much larger field.
Wow.
So this one's a kind of a unique little case. I don't know who owns 99, but that's an extra feature.
That's stunning. That's awesome. That's cool.
It's the secret seahorse, basically. Something like this was really, really interesting. This is one where the top half is really different from the bottom half.
What number is that? 102?
102. I didn't expect this to happen at all. I think. Yeah, the bottom has these really interesting streaks. I think this is one of those. Yeah, 64 feedback resolution.
That's cool.
This one's much more like drippy paint than any of the other ones.
I see that.
Yeah,
do you have one more? Maybe we can take a look at one more.
Yeah, I think one of my super favorites, I honestly wish that yes, this one, 148.
Ooh. Yeah, preview looks really good. What specifically about this piece do you like?
So this one has this multicolored stripy component, which I don't think occurs in any of the other pieces, right? So you see this like almost like a topography.
like some rivers or some kind of like streams.
And it takes a while to become legible. I think this one you have to see in its entirety. Let's see.
And what was the number on that one again? Just for people tuning in.
This one was 148.
140. Okay.
Yeah. So when it's bigger, you see the details a little bit more here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this, this was so totally unpredictable from my perspective, because all of the brushes are, doing their own like little choreography. And so I'd never seen them actually cross over like this to produce this striping effect. So for me, this one is super unique and definitely one of my favorites, if not my favorite.
I love it. Well, this has been really cool. I appreciate you talking about RASTER and just like the different ideas and kind of just your vision for that project. I think it's always just super interesting to talk to artists and get that one-on-one and learn a little bit more about the project.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to know, like, you mentioned kind of some background in architecture. How do you think about that and how it intersects with generative art?
Yeah, so I run my own architectural practice called Office Ca, C-A, the first two letters of my last name. And we have mostly made smaller installations. We haven't really built like full buildings just yet, because we've only been practicing for a couple of years. But we use generative procedures to make our designs. We use a lot of rules to help us generate like forms and shapes and spaces. So it's not really that removed from what I do. I mean, obviously, art is a little bit more freeing, right? It's a little bit more expressive. When it comes to architecture, you have a lot more constraints, right? Like gravity, right, is a pretty big constraint.
Yeah.
But I think we're really into geometry, and we're really into color and sort of procedural rule-based design. So it really fits into this type of thinking pretty seamlessly.
Cool. That's awesome. And, obviously with the conclusion of RASTER, I always love talking to artists just a little bit about mental health, because I find it just so important in the space that's, super busy and there's just things happening all the time. Like after you how do you wind down once a project is fully minted out, or maybe even during the process? Like, how do you go about kind of thinking about mental health in the process of creating a project?
Yeah, that's really tricky. So I've honestly treated coding as kind of by like a relaxation exercise. I mean, not debugging, right? Like debugging is this whole other thing, but like just putting things down. I'll sit in front of the TV and I'll put on a show that I've already seen or something, and I'll just like, start doodling. For me, that's how I relax for the most part. It's just messing around with colors and just painting and stuff. And luckily, some of the processing software that I've been making are meditative painting apps, where I just put in a stroke and then see what happens. So for me, like painting is actually kind of how I relax. But for the most part, I think just spending time offline is really, really good for me. Unfortunately, you get bombarded with messages and stuff, especially as you start to get a little bit more profiled with like different platforms, etc. And so I think the hardest part for me is not feeling like I have to respond to everybody, essentially, right? I don't want to feel like I'm on call, but sometimes that pressure actually does come back. And so I think just knowing when to disengage, I think is super healthy. And I'm just a big TV and couch person. So Yeah.
That's always good. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And, I know it's towards the end of the year, but I'm curious to know, maybe even for, 2023, do you have any projects or exhibitions or, just things planned for the upcoming new year?
Yeah, mostly in terms of my academic work. I haven't really been working on another generative project. I was working on another one while I was doing raster, and I actually released that on FX hash. But I don't really have anything else in the pipeline for right now. I mean, I'm always sketching. I'm always just putting things down, trying out some ideas. But I will have. I'm like 90% sure that I'll have an exhibition in Soho, New York, in December, and that's going to be interesting because I'm working with some screen printers, and so we're going to try to screen print an algorithm that's similar to raster. It sort of comes from the same place, and we're going to see how that turns out with screen printing techniques.
I love it. That's
which
fantastic.
I've never done before, so I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, I bet. Well, you'll have to share, more information about that on social media. And speaking of that, how can people reach you? Should they have any questions? I know you have a website, so maybe you want to go ahead and plug all that in right now.
Yeah. So my personal website is just my name, my full name, and I'm fully doxed. Just Gallo Canizares, CANIZARES.com. Mostly, I think the easiest way to reach me is on Twitter. Unfortunately, I'm there like too often, like I said. I'm at Gallo and Stuff, which is a handle that I made a long time ago, and Twitter made it very difficult to change it because somebody else had itsgalo, and I've been going by itsgalo online since 2011, I think.
Oh, wow.
And so you can reach me on Twitter or on Instagram at itsgalo. I think on every NFT platform I'm at itsgalo, and on Discord as well.
Cool. Well, itsgalo, I really appreciate you joining me on After Dinner Mints. It's been a pleasure, learning about your project Raster and, just learning a little bit more about your background. I appreciate you.
Great. Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Absolutely. Well, for everyone tuning in, Art Blocks After Dinner Mints discussions are also available as a podcast. They're available weekly. You can check us out on Spotify, Apple, Google, and Amazon. Finally, we have a weekly newsletter that gets delivered once a week with information on upcoming drops and generative art related news. You can find a link to the newsletter in the description of this YouTube video. Again, thank you to itsgalo for joining me on After Dinner Mints. For everyone tuning in, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe to our Art Blocks YouTube channel. Be kind to each other, buy what you love, and we will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.